So the Cold War was a time of war between the rebels, including Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader on that snowy planet in Star Wars, right? Well, not exactly. Okay, so in all seriousness, the Cold War was between the US and Russia primarily. The Cold War started right after World War II ended in an Allied victory. The US and the Soviet Union were now the major powerhouses of the world. The Cold War was a long drawn-out process that lasted 46 years and encompassed many countries and events. After World War II ended, the three leaders of the US, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union met in Yalta to discuss how Europe was supposed to be fixed and divided after the war. The United States and Great Britain had different ideas about how this should go than the Soviet Union. This disagreement could be said to have been the start of the Cold War. Later, the Truman Doctrine was created. This doctrine basically said that the US would help the countries that were threatened by communism. This is what the Cold War was ultimately about, stopping the spread of communism and containing it to the Soviet Union. NATO. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it was founded in 1949. The organization consisted of the United States and 11 other countries. Its purpose was to police Europe and to set up an alliance to stop communism. The Korean War started in June of 1950 when a large force of North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel in South Korea. The 38th parallel was a line of latitude that divided the North from the South. The war ended in 1953, basically in a stalemate with some nearly 5 million lives lost. Later, the Warsaw Pact was signed on May 14, 1955. The main goal of the pact was to form a Soviet alliance with other countries. Realistically, this pact allowed the Soviet Union to continue existing and allow it to keep troops in its satellite states and control them. This pact rivaled NATO and created a greater divide between the East and the West. The pact was only supposed to last for 20 years, but was eventually renewed.
The Cold War continued, and in the early 1960s, President Kennedy faced many troubling situations in our own hemisphere, such as the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 took place in Cuba when armed Cuban exiles tried to overthrow Castro government with the help of the U.S. After this failed attempt, Castro then became closer with Communist Russia. About a year later, in October 1962, the U.S. learned of the nuclear missiles Russia was supplying Cuba. President Kennedy responded to the Russian leader by promising to not invade Cuba and to end their quarantine. Had this crisis not been handled correctly, the world could have broken out into nuclear war. This is one of the few examples of the Cold War where the two principal countries actually got involved against each other instead of fighting through other nations on their behalf. With high tension between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the Cold War continued. Around the same time period, they continued the war to space, also known as the space race. The Soviets, a step ahead of the U.S., were the first to launch a man into outer space in April 1961. Later in May 1961, the U.S. tied the score by sending Alan Shepard up to be the first American in outer space. After this accomplishment for the U.S., President Kennedy claimed the U.S. would land a man on the moon. A few years later, on July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, winning the space race for the U.S. Also, throughout the Cold War, the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War to help South Vietnam win against the North and not become a communist country. Realizing their loss, in 1969, President Nixon began removing U.S. troops from Vietnam and by 1973 ended American involvement, causing the South to then surrender to the North. This was a major blow to the U.S. during the Cold War. As soon as President Nixon had taken office, he began to take a new approach to international relations. In 1972, Nixon and the Soviet Premier signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty to prohibit the making of nuclear missiles on both sides. Although despite Nixon's efforts, the Cold War later heated up again under President Reagan.
The United States established diplomatic relations with China in January of 1979. This ambassadorial-level diplomacy ended a long period of estrangement between the two countries. The U.S. chose to sever its ties with the Republic of China and instead chose to recognize the People's Republic of China to be the sole legitimate government. In December of 1979, the Soviet Army invaded Afghanistan in support of the Afghan Communist government. The government was being threatened by anti-communist Muslim freedom fighters. The Soviet Union sent 30,000 troops to suppress the Mujahideen, who were the collective group of tribal and urban rebels opposing the state and its leader, Barak Karmal. The Mujahideen's power strengthened with the support of the United States, and eventually their uprising became too much for the Soviet army to combat. The Soviet Union withdrew their troops and left in February of 1989. A Solidarity Union was formed in Poland in August of 1980. The union, made up of over 9.4 million members, gave rise to a broad anti-communist social movement and ultimately contributed to the fall of communism. The members of the union used nonviolent strike and protest tactics to gain the attention of the government. The People's Republic of Poland declared martial law from 1981 to 1983. The government banned Solidarity and jailed and killed any of its supporters. However, Solidarity gained international support from famous figureheads such as Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and the Pope. Even with the ban, underground Solidarity organizations assembled and continued to protest. In March of 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the new leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev sought to democratize the country's political system and decentralize its economy. He ended the Soviet Union's post-war domination of Eastern Europe. Gorbachev did so by establishing reforms such as glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness, and it allowed freedom of expression and freedom of information for citizens. Perestroika means restructuring and introduced multi-candidate elections and secret ballots into select political races. In September of the same year, after Solidarity was legalized, the Union formed an electoral campaign and won, forming the first post-war non-communist government in Poland. The following month, Hungary declared a non-communist government as well. In November, East Germany announced the allowance of unrestricted migration to West Germany. The decision was made after authorities in East Germany recognized the large number of citizens still fleeing despite the wall. They came to a conclusion that the restriction was only making matters worse. The government's hope was to emphasize its new pledge for change by giving the people back their freedom to stay or leave. Weeks later, the Berlin Wall was demolished. Citizens took their hammers and picks and knocked chunks out of the wall. Cranes and bulldozers arrived and took down the rest of the wall section by section. In May of 1990, George Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to reunify Germany in the year 1994. Bush called it a victory for democracy and freedom. The two sides established a constitutional and economic merger and made a treaty. Boris Yeltsin was then appointed to be the president of Russia in December of 1991 after Gorbachev resigned. The Soviet Union was consequently abolished, and after 4 decades, the Cold War came to an end.